We're the Vinyl Verdict. I'm Jacob.
I'm Michael.
And we're here to talk about the new Mal Evans book by Kenneth Womack. And this is an interesting one because it touches on both the Beatles world in a big way, and obviously he's the fifth or sixth Beatle, depending on how you count it, but at the same time also had a huge pivotal role in Badfinger's history, so something close to our hearts. So we definitely wanted to cover this in detail, and there's a lot of new information coming to light because this was sourced off his diaries. Pretty rare in 2023, I think, to have new first-hand accounts. It feels like everybody has said their piece, and we're getting into second and third generation fans just talking like us about the things we enjoyed, but it's pretty amazing to get a new perspective on the actual original story.
Well, it's a well written book, and his life, Mal's life, as is told in this book, is to any Beatle fan, it's pretty riveting. We all have seen him in the background. We all have seen him from all along, from the swimmer in Help who gets up in the Bahamas and they direct him to the White Cliffs of Dover, and to really behind the scenes, being the roadie, which wasn't even a word that was used at that time, doing everything on tour for them. And what the book makes clear is, which I wasn't really aware of, is his inner conflicts and his conflicts between the family that he had in England and his devotion to the Beatles and the life that he had on the road, which was meeting countless people. And with Neil Aspinall was really the door that anybody had to go through to get to the Beatles, and that's pretty huge. The reason it's special is because it tells about his life after the Beatles, and about how he was affected by their breaking up, and at the same time it speaks of his deep love for them. It speaks of his inner turmoil quite a bit, about torn between his life in California and the family that he left in England, which Gary has some insight into and is a pivotal, I agree, is a great source, obviously. And the combination is just striking. I thought it was really well done and very poignant. Mal's life would touch anybody's heart, I think.
Mal definitely wanted to tell this story, which is kind of more of a historiography of how this book came to light. But he had tried to write an autobiography multiple times, or kind of his story from the band. I think the final version that was pretty close was 200 Miles to Go, which is kind of the story of that first drive, taking them back from London. It was never published, and then after, the tragedy at the end of his life, it sounds like it kind of sat on the floor and it was saved. And obviously, again, there's a whole separate story there, but it's interesting how much Mal wanted this story told, and it was ironically almost the last story from a Beatle that's ever been told, or from someone in that inner orbit. I think the theme, and I want to really go through like his whole path related to the Beatles and Badfinger, it seems like it was, in the beginning, very closely aligned. Like the first 3 or 4 years, it feels like a lot of the same stories we've heard again and again and again. That's almost become the official story of each of their tour stops and many things like this. But it really diverges after they stop touring. And obviously, as a roadie, as he tries to find his new purpose, there are some really new scenes with the Beatles that I never knew happened. And again, especially in the solo career.
As the Beatles go into their Apple phase and trying to be business owners, business people, which they really weren't. And Mal carried this to the end of his life, where he wanted to be different things than what was called a roadie, or what he was. There's no word for it. He was totally devoted to the Beatles. But he's a crucial link in the Badfinger story that I, as a Badfinger fan, never realized how much he believed in No Matter What, and how much he was promoting the song, and how the reception wasn't exactly real warm relating to that at Apple. And he still believed in Badfinger and stayed with them and had a deep love for them, just as he did for the Beatles. And the politics of how he was edged out of that, it's another story. But the point is that what a life he had. And for any Beatles or Badfinger fan, Mal was critical.
I mean, it really kicks off, I guess, with it's January 1963, and Love Me Do is on the charts. Please Please Me is just released as the new single, and that hits number 1. And Mal is a 27-year-old telecommunications engineer. He offers to, he drives the bus when Neil Aspinall is sick, and that's kind of how he gets involved. They pay him and ask him to do it one time. And then he slowly becomes the bouncer, and outside of the Cavern Club, and he's a big guy, obviously. We've heard different things, 6'2", 6'6", but menacing figure, but with a big heart and everything, but perfect for a bouncer. That's kind of how it starts. I think we knew that much.
Well, we knew that much, but the book makes clear some things I was not really aware of for his deep love of Elvis and his worship of Elvis, even as he came to have the same feeling for the cavern Beatles, who he heard outside playing in the cavern. And the next thing you know is he's got the same love for them.
Goes into, his background a bit too. I thought there was an interesting chapter about him being rejected from the army when his friends were accepted, and some kind of love issues he faced when he was younger. And so he's characterized at least as a bit of an outcast. I mean, can anyone be anything but an outcast with how tight the four Beatles were? So, he really became obviously close with each of them individually. They almost made fun of that a little bit, the outcast thing, and in the movies and his roles and everything. It's interesting, but again, this part of the book I think is fairly familiar. And there's some tension with Brian, which I never really knew about, the manager.
That's a good point.
And partially because Brian had very savory taste, I think, about the Beatles' PR image, and Mal was a little bit of a pimp, for lack of a better term, for them. And so there was a lot of tension, I think, about that image and kind of the influence that Mal had. But he was more than a roadie, you're right. I mean, he was helping them with anything they ever asked him for, drugs, whatever it was. And so Brian was more of a filter, I think. And so that was an interesting piece. Doing some of the culinary stuff.
Anything, toast, beans and toast for Ringo, or anything. He was also a little bit like motherly love almost around them, like taking care of them. And Mal, get this, Mal, get that. He did, and I don't think it made his home life too pleasant a lot. I think it was a great strain, and he always felt that. But he was devoted to them, no doubt.
One of the very, very few short list of people who actually played on Beatles records. And it started out small. It started out as similar to bringing someone tea or whatever they needed. And so the first mention is he played the organ on You Won't See Me, which is just holding down that note. And then he claimed, contributing the line on Here, There, and Everywhere, I think, Watching Her Eyes. And so it's, these very small little pieces that he's like, it's like the last puzzle piece of a lot of these songs that he's assisting with, but really going above and beyond what a roadie would ever do. And they go to Kenya together, which I think maybe I've seen a picture of Paul there, but these are really kind of missing chapters in the narrative of the Beatles story that you don't really see. And I'd always heard on the way back from there, on the plane, is when the idea for Sgt. Pepper kind of comes up. Mal worked on Sgt. Pepper and Fixing a Hole, and then this is kind of new information that Mal, mentions in the diary, or these first-hand sources, that Paul promised him royalties and songwriting credit at the time. And that there was really this optimism that he would be in the songwriting business, at least, or ghostwriting at least later. I think it was just that he would get some royalties or something, and never happened. But at this time, Lennon McCartney was a pretty powerful team, and there was no room for an Evans in there.
No, it was interesting. Paul makes a comment to Mal about him being, a servant and do what we want you to do. And Mal, for all his size and everything, was a sensitive guy. And he cut him to the quick when he heard that. And in a reversal of roles, it was John who said to him, well, those who serve lead. And this, I think it was from a Milton poem and from World War II English philosophy. Anyway, he ended up writing a poem about it himself. But that comment of Paul's cut him pretty deeply.
Mm-hmm. He's with Paul again in the Rockies when he comes up with the Magical Mystery Tour idea. Here's our first mention of Badfinger-related content. So March of 1967, Bill Collins brings up the Ivies to Paul McCartney, which I found fascinating. March 1967,
That's
way before Apple. I'm assuming not way before, but shortly after that, Apple was founded. And Mal, again, takes on wherever he can help. He becomes the A&R man. So, fast forwarding a long time here now. January 22nd, 1968, he has lunch with Bill Collins. He kind of shares his intentions with Peter, Asher, and then Neil Aspinall, and then actually Paul McCartney directly at these early Apple meetings of wanting to get the Ivies involved. And, I was really careful. I was looking at the citations of all this because I wanted to know what is new information here, and, especially because there's not a ton of new Badfinger information coming out. A lot of the Ron Griffith stuff is taken from the Dan Matavina book, Without You, which is, going on 25 years ago or something at this point, as well as like the Tom Evans quotes and stuff and Bill Collins. And so a lot of this is rehashing kind of older material, but obviously important to the story, and you're not going to get more primary sources from them. But the Mal Evans perspective is completely new. Basically saying people just didn't care about this. He was showing it to people, and Paul McCartney wasn't very impressed.
But the Badfinger connection's fascinating to me, how of all people, it was Mal Evans who not only knew about them, but really was trying to get the Beatles and Apple to sign them. And he was, what a strange twist of history that he knew about the future Badfinger, and he actually is the guy who promoted them.
At the end of May, finally another demo tape, and Mal makes a very impassioned speech, he says. The book pitches it as this was kind of done as a favor to Mal. So the next thing, there's an internal memo that Derek Taylor sends out in 1968 saying that the Ivies is a band that Mal Evans found, so he will produce them. And it's like a newsletter update. And so I'd never seen that before, which was kind of cool. And now here we are, August 9th of 1968, and the Ivies are recording Maybe Tomorrow, the song. It kind of jumps around a little bit. So then obviously we go from that Ivies thing, we leave that, and we go back to the Beatles. And he mentions the Mother Malcolm story, that Let It Be originally had that. Let It Be originally was not Mother Mary, but Mother Malcolm. There is a bit where he says Mother Malcolm and everything. It's in the White Album demo. But it conflicts with Paul McCartney's story that he had a dream about his mom.
Yeah, it really does. Well, or he put it in for whatever reason. But also, along those lines, in the Peter Jackson film, Mal is seen during The Long and Winding Road, really with Paul writing down every word and suggesting, don't leave me waiting here versus don't leave me standing here, or whatever it was.
He was very involved, and again, if I had to speculate, I would say this is classic kind of Beatles Liverpudlian humor to change lines for people and kind of to not take themselves too seriously, and so he might have changed it from his mom, which is obviously probably a very sentimental song for him, to mentioning Mal Evans in the room or whatever and singing to him kind of as a joke. I think Paul's story is probably more credible and makes more sense. Why would he write a song about Mal Evans? Not sure, but interesting point that came up there that conflicted a little bit. Around this time, Mal Evans writes in his diary that Maybe Tomorrow is one of the most beautiful songs he's ever heard. So how about that? That's pretty cool.
It is.
And he's heard a lot of good music. He also mentions that he says the Ivies felt that Tony Visconti, their producer, was pushing them in a direction they didn't want to go, and they asked Mal to produce them at this point. So that's kind of interesting that the request was actually coming from the Ivies themselves. Mal is involved in the promo video for Maybe Tomorrow, which famously, and I think we noticed this, that, hey, they kind of look like the Beatles. They're wearing suits. They have these bowl cuts. That was kind of Mal Evans wanting to have matching suits like the Beatles. And then Mal took charge of the American release of the album, Maybe Tomorrow. And, spoiler, that doesn't happen, because this is something Mal Evans is responsible for. Alan Klein and other people want him to fail at it. So it's never released more broadly. So then we get to July 24th. And this is interesting. This 1969 timeline stuff I find fascinating. So in July, Paul records Come and Get It. The diary reveals also Mal played tambourine on the recording. Officially mentions that Paul and him are both in the studio when the Ivies are recording this. So. And then things get really compressed. So this was fascinating to me. So Mal sees the Ivies live on September 12th, 1969. He's a roadie for John Lennon the next week in Toronto. John Lennon's first performance. 8 days later, just a couple days after that, John makes this comment of wanting a divorce, and he's helping to produce Cold Turkey the next week. So it's just amazing. The month of September 1969, it's amazing how much is going on. And he accompanies Bill Collins to the taping of Top of the Pops on January, I think it's like January 3rd, 1970. So really cool to see the interplay of kind of the Badfinger timelines and some of this Beatles stuff that's shaking out. He joins John Lennon for Instant Karma on Top of the Pops. It's always been told the last time the four Beatles were together was these pictures at Tittenhurst, which is September, I believe, of 1969. Kind of the final photo shoot and the final one of them all waving goodbye. Again and again, this is the only time I've ever heard. Revelatory then that in Mal Evans' diary he mentions Patty Harrison's 26th birthday in Friar Park and the housewarming for Friar Park, because George Harrison just moved in. He says all four Beatles were here in March of 1970, and this was the last time he saw all four of them together. I'd love to know more about that. He does It Don't Come Easy, which was offered to Badfinger. I don't know that I ever knew that.
I don't believe I did.
But he says it was offered to Badfinger in early 1970. I can't imagine Badfinger singing this song. It's kind of wild. But Mal did a guide vocal singing It Don't Come Easy that's been lost.
I didn't know that.
So George Harrison also sang a guide vocal on it. So then Paul announces the split in April, so we kind of get back to the major timeline we're all familiar with. In April 18th, less than a week after that, Mal Evans brings Badfinger to EMI, and he produces 4 tracks, No Matter What, and Without You is one of them, which also kind of conflicts with what I'd always been told. I always heard Without You was the last song written for No Dice, and that they kind of stuck these two together.
Yes.
It's actually one of the first 4 that's produced months before they do the No Dice sessions. Maybe it was the last one written, but it seems like it was one of their early choices for something they wanted to record first. I don't know that we've ever heard that first take from April that was on that acetate. There's an interview here with Joey Mullen from April of 2023 that's cited, saying that he wrote the solo, and that actually part of that effect of the solo, which we know, I think he put it through a Leslie speaker, but he's also quoted as saying that he did a steel lap solo over the slide guitar solo. So that's giving it kind of that chorus effect as well. But that's kind of cool that Joey Mullen was interviewed as recently as April for this book. There's a Marianne Evans interview that's only quoted twice in the whole book, and this is one of the times mentioning that Tom Evans and her had double dated with Mal. You know, I kind of questioned when I saw this, and this was from May of 2021. So it's actually one of the first pieces of research, it seems like, that was done for the book, was him speaking to Marianne Evans, probably because of Gary Evans having a close relationship with her. The diary entry here is very clear. I mean, sometimes he's a little bit ambiguous in his diary, but Mal blames Alan Klein 100%. Alan Klein stirring trouble between Bill Collins and Mal Evans and telling Bill Collins that Mal Evans was a threat to him. And there's a cool quote here from January of 71 from Mal Evans that he says, "I feel hung up about not producing Badfinger at the moment, having put so much time and effort and belief into them." So, I mean, writing that in his diary is pretty amazing. And this is only a couple months, 6 months after he had worked with them, and the song is on the radio and top 10 hit across the world. So amazing. The Try Some Buy Some session, where George Harrison wrote this song and worked with Ronnie Spector to sing it, is in 71, and he mentions Pete Ham is there, and Mal Evans is also there. I mean, so he's kind of saying that he sees Pete Ham, I think, for the next time is at this session. I always wondered if Pete worked with George again after Bangladesh, but it's clear, again, the backing track was recorded for Ronnie Spector in 71, before Straight Up, and then George Harrison used that backing track and sang a new vocal for Living in the Material World, and then released it in 73. August 1971, Mal Evans sees the concert for Bangladesh, and he says, "I was proud to see a guy I thought of as my protege standing alongside another dear friend in the limelight, which he richly deserved." January 17th, 1972, Mal is right there with Todd Rundgren as they contemplate a follow-up to Straight Up. Mal Evans is there with Todd Rundgren in the studio and thinking about what's going to happen after Straight Up and actually learning some audio engineering. August of 1973, he's at Bill Collins' wedding. Kind of interesting, so there wasn't that much tension. So he sees Badfinger there in August. And the other really revelatory thing for me in this book, he produces Splinter. Similar to what I guess the Ivies were and James Taylor and stuff for Apple Records, Splinter was like the first band on Dark Horse, I think. There's this song, Lonely Man, that Mal Evans wrote, which features George and Pete Ham on guitar, and Klaus Worman on bass, Jim Keltner on drums, and he's sitting there watching in the control room as George Harrison and Pete Ham play guitar to his song. And it's recorded in November of 1973. So pretty revelatory that Ass is already recorded. It's done. They're probably recording the self-titled album as well, or starting to for the Warner Brothers. And here are George Harrison and Pete Ham recording a song together. That's crazy. I'm amazed that here, this is 2 years after Day After, more than 2 years after Day After Day. And they're working on something together. And so I think so then Splinter re-recorded it on their album, but I guess there's a version that was used in this movie that I need to find that is the original version with Pete Ham and George Harrison playing guitar. So we will find that and maybe even upload it on this channel. You know, hopefully it doesn't get taken down. Mal Evans has an affair, very similar paths now to John Lennon's life, and goes through a separation, moves to LA. John Lennon has his separation with Yoko Ono, moves to LA, and they kind of had this lost weekend period together. I think we knew a bit about this. I don't think it was obvious to me how much they were just reconnecting for the first time since 71, since Imagine.
No, and I really didn't know that Mal was even out here and so intertwined with it. So it's a big thing that I learned from the book.
And he's continuing to work with all the Beatles now. So he tells all the Beatles he's going to leave and do his songwriting now because of with Splinter, right? He's going to go and that doesn't really happen. They wish him well. It's kind of like a reverse psychology. But he works on Goodnight Vienna. He produces a Keith Moon album, but it kind of implodes. He sees George Harrison live in LA in 1974, the same time you saw him. He's on the boat at the Venus and Mars rap party in 75.
Yeah, that was interesting.
Yeah, with George Harrison also. And then in April of 75, he hears the news about Pete Ham. There's no citation for this in the book, he says he hears about Pete Ham's suicide from Tom Evans. There is a citation here from an audio tape in September of 75 from Beatles Fest. I think it might have been the first or second Beatles Fest in September of 75. And he's asked about Pete Ham. And he chokes up and says it was a very sad moment for him earlier that year. There's a lot here towards the end about trying to get a book deal on the Beatles. His divorce is looking closer and closer to finalized with Lily. And lots of drugs, all of this, kind of violent threatening with the gun a couple times, and a lot of foreshadowing about this earlier in the book because of the Western obsession and everything. Yeah. And then there's one last Badfinger tie-in here, right? In December of 75, Mal Evans expresses interest in recording the demos for Natural Gas in L.A. So it almost comes full circle now that he almost gets an opportunity again to be involved in a slice of Badfinger and to produce them, and he's working with them, and he says he's excited to work with them in the new year. And McCartney calls and is saying, I want you involved in my 76 tour, the Wings Over America. And so it looks like all these people who wasn't allowed to work with, there's a lot of hope again. There's even a new Mark Clark interview from a guy from Natural Gas that's quoted. And he only has one citation in the whole book. 2022, he was interviewed by this Kenneth Womack. And he says, Mal asked for an exorbitant fee. Band basically votes that we're not going to pay Mal Evans this amount that he's asking for. And the context makes a little more sense because we see all these examples of Mal Evans getting screwed, obviously with songwriting credit, with production credit, basically receiving no royalties. And so here he is finally taking a stand for himself, and unfortunately, they veto against it. The dark final chapters here. Lily tells Mal that she's going to file for a divorce on January 6th of 76. Mal likely called John Lennon. And then very interestingly, I mentioned that there's this interview with Marianne Evans in 2021. This is the second time that it's ever cited in the book as saying that Mal Evans called Tom Evans on January 3rd, saying, if something ever happens to me, can you look after Lily? Which is pretty amazing that he is still this close with Tom Evans. All too familiar for him, probably, of what this meant. He writes a will the evening of January 3rd, and he asks the Beatles to play at his funeral. Likely, it's kind of speculated that losing his kids in the divorce was probably the final straw. Kind of all know the rest from there. Valium was involved, a gun was involved, the police were involved, and he never is alive for the divorce never occurs. And the Beatles none of the Beatles show up at his funeral. I think this is kind of interesting. Again, it's there's a practicality to it of not wanting it to turn into a circus. It seems like, of course, the tragedy of his life is that he gave so much to the Beatles and none of the Beatles really have spoken about him. Unlike, I'd say, the Badfinger situation, his tragedy was very personal. It seems like it had much more to do with his family and his kids and his wife. But it is very interrelated to what was happening with Badfinger and almost feeling like entering the Beatles' orbit was pretty toxic.
Well, the book makes clear the conflict internally which is going on with Mal, which is multi-layered, but generally you could start with being torn between his responsibilities to his family in England and his life which he was trying to create in California. That internal conflict was really tearing him apart. And he felt great guilt. Beyond that, the depression, which in the end is what comes in, it was multi-layered and obviously quite deep for him, And the people that don't think he's so great and don't think he's so affable are his family in England that he has been parted from frequently and long periods of time, and a great weight throughout that is on him. And the ending is, by any definition, not an upending. And that's the story. Depression proved bigger than his good nature. But he was one of the two guys closest to the Beatles. Indispensable.
So I'm interested to read the second book, I think, which comes out next year, which is the primary source material and his diaries and everything like this and things from the archive. There's a little bit of trying to write a narrative around it and to make this a little more accessible to someone who isn't as familiar with his life. Like I said, revelatory, knowing the four Beatles were in a room again, another time, and some of this knowing that George Harrison and Pete Ham played together. There's very interesting information in here that I'd love to see, kind of the diary, the actual pages of those descriptions. For that matter, any of the diaries kept by the Beatles and Badfinger, which I don't know. I'm sure they exist somewhere. And so maybe it took 60 years or 50 years and we're finally getting to the point that instead of trying to cultivate this very clean PR version of history, we can just open the floodgates and allow us to interpret that for ourselves and learn the real story here. And so I think this book is very invigorating just for that reason, that it's allowing us to get this information into kind of the darkness of the Beatles' orbit. But you got to wonder how much one trajectory affected the other. How much of Badfinger's trajectory at Apple was affected by the fact that they were endorsed by Mal Evans, which some people at Apple didn't like. And how much was Mal Evans' life affected by his frustration about, probably not as much, but somewhat about this opportunity he had of going into production and songwriting and being turned away from it both by Badfinger and then in some other cases where he wasn't able to successfully pursue that.
I'm just thinking it's an eye-opener to read something I never knew. Is here he is with his produced version of No Matter What finished, taking it into Apple, playing it for different people, and no positive response on it, no encouragement.
And then 6 months later they release it anyway and it's a hit.
Yeah.
It's like so delayed that at least he gets enough satisfaction to see that and kind of know, I was right. But there's no recognition for it. There's no reward. He doesn't get to produce the next album. George Harrison comes in and takes it away from him.
The book really, really tears your heart apart. There's a lot of beautiful, touching things, and there's a lot of highlights, and then there's unbelievable depression and low points when things just don't come to fruition for him in the end.
So that was Living the Beatles Legend, the Kenneth Womack book that was just released. Highly recommended if you're a Beatles fan or a Badfinger fan. Really, this and Dan Matavinas Without You book and Joey Mullen's book, Badfinger and Beyond, are really the only primary sources on Badfinger's history from these other angles. So really grateful to have this and looking forward to the second book next year.